this evening on the topic of multiculturalism as it relates to professional spaces. The talk happens within the broader context or series of culture shock series. So let's talk a little bit about multiculturalism in professional spaces. Obviously, there will be a time to be able to ask questions. So you are welcome to be jotting down those thoughts if you want to engage further. And it's good to have a conversation around these topics. So as per Mabongi's very generous intro, I am a pastor, and through that platform, I get to do various things, but it all relates to the business of human life, really. And the spaces that we occupy and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's an important thing. So this is just one of those. And within the context of this topic, multiculturalism in professional spaces. Okay, let's begin with definitions. Let's define culture in the simplest definition. Culture is a way of life of a people group. It's a way of life of a people group. So when we talk about culture, we're talking about an identity of a collective, whether it's in a broader sense, maybe blacks versus whites, Indians, in a much more specific sense, Zulus, Xhosas, those tribal expressions. So when we're talking culture, we're talking about a way of life of a people group. We are talking about a collective identity within a broader family of nations. In other words, culture is really a way in which a people group interprets its own identity within itself, number one, but also a way in which a people group presents itself to other people groups. So culture serves that role of presentation, of introduction. For that reason, culture becomes quite an important component of humanity, of various, diverse people groups, because it is a very way in which people get to distinguish themselves, so to speak, amongst the family of nations. And that really means that at the very core of the subject of culture is the deep existential question. Culture speaks into the very issue of existence. There is a deeper existential question within the context of culture. In other words, when we respect someone's culture, we're really respecting their origins and their very existence, because culture is that way in which a people group gets to introduce itself, present itself, make itself significant amongst the family of nations, amongst other people groups. So it is an existential tool. It is an existential platform, culture. That equally means that an assault on one's culture is really an assault on their existence. And I'm going through those definitions and ideas or to highlight, why it is that we find that there is these conflicts that happen in the process of cultural interactions. When we don't respect someone's culture, we essentially are assaulting their very existence. And that's how people understand it. That's how people embrace it. Equally for us, living out and expressing our culture, by default, we become advocates, we become stewards, we become defenders of culture. And so when we walk into a space, we walk, carrying that and becoming that embodiment of something bigger than us, something bigger than our personhood. And that is the existence of a broader collective that we represent in a particular space. And anything that is hostile to that essentially is coming after our sense of existence, is coming after a people that may not be in the room at that particular point in time that we're experiencing hostility, but that we carry and are much more aware of as we interact with life. And so in that sense, we become the advocates of the culture that we come from. We become the stewards, and we become the defenders of the culture from which we come. So culture is a way of life of a people group. In other words, when we talk about culture, we're talking beyond just your personal habits. We're talking beyond just your personality. We're talking really about the broader context from which you come, the broader social construct that has perhaps formed who you are and shaped your consciousness. And if that is culture, multiculturalism, therefore, is the interface of distinct cultures, of diverse people groups in a common space. And that common space can be the workplace, can be church, can be a school, can be a neighborhood. Spaces of human congregation become places of interactions of culture. And obviously, that's where the complexity arises in the process of that interaction and what happens as people interact. In other words, the space of multiculturalism can either be a front line of war or a place of diplomatic exchange, of exchange of life, depending on how we relate and interact. We wake up in the morning every day and go to work. And in so many ways, the workplace can become a front line of some sort, an assault, an offensive, a place where we are contending with other cultures and on how those cultures are interacting with us, if there's respect, that becomes a beautiful place of cultural exchange, and if there's hostility, the workplace becomes a front line. And of course, we don't want that. Culture shock within that. So we've defined culture as a way of life of a people group. Multiculturalism is a process of interaction, of interface of different cultures. Culture shock is that sense of misalignment between our internal view of our sense of culture versus the culture of the environment in which we find ourselves. It is that mental and emotional discomfort that we may experience, hopefully for a short while, temporarily, as we enter into a space and as we interact with a sense of misalignment between our own culture, the culture from which we come, and the culture of the environment that we are currently abiding in, whether that, again, is workplace, whether that is church, whether that is a school. That's what culture shock is. It's a sense of misalignment between the outer world and the inner world, your concept, our own concept of culture. Really, the issue is that in culture really speaks of the reality that we have been raised a particular way, we've been socialized in a particular way, and even discipled in a particular way. There is, in fact, an organic discipleship process that happens in any cultural context from the time that you are a child, as you grow, everything, it's learning, you're assimilating, you're observing, you're being taught, you're being corrected. Certain definitions are being formed within you, and your concept of the world is forming. And in fact, the one other thing that I want to introduce to us that relates to culture is the whole concept of the worldview. So the worldview, we all have a worldview. And a worldview may sound like a fancy word, for some, but actually we all have a worldview. A worldview is your inner concept of the world. We all have an inner construct of the world. And that is informed by the culture from which we come, it's informed by how we have been socialized in the process as we grow. And here's the thing, here's where it becomes quite important. The worldview really means that we see life through the lens of culture. We see life through the lens of culture. We are never innocent when we walk into a space. We have a pre-configured lens through which we're going to see life, through which you're going to interpret behavior, through which you're going to make sense of the right and the wrong, the good and the evil. And that's all shaped by the way of life that has informed us. So the worldview is your inner concept of the world about the variety of issues of life. And that inner concept of the world is informed by the culture from which you come. And when you enter into a space, you have a lens through which you see and judge people's behavior. And the wise thing, therefore, that we can always do as human beings is to always understand people's cultures, because in understanding people's cultures, we're understanding how they interpret what we do and say to them. And so this culture education becomes important in the understanding of different cultural constructs, because it's like, oh yeah, perhaps if I speak loud, this is what it means to you. If I speak softly, if my handshake is firm, this is what it means. If my handshake is soft, this is what it means. If I'm looking at you eyeball to eyeball, this is what it means. If I am not looking at you, all of those things carry meaning. So people have a worldview, which is the inner concept of the world, informed by the culture from which we come. The wise thing to do is to understand people's cultures and people's backgrounds so that we can understand how people see us. People don't just see us through the naked eye, they see us through the eye of culture that has shaped them. And so the worldview dilemma is, again, that tension and conflict between the outer world and your inner world. And that what causes a sense of culture shock and then this discomfort that we go through when we enter into a space. And that culture shock can at times produce what I call some form of culture, a culture Cold War. We understand the whole idea of a Cold War, historically in the environment of international politics, which is not the subject of the evening, but this culture Cold War can be the product of the sense of culture shock. So in other words, at the very least, when we walk into a space, we can experience culture shock in a temporary way, where we have a degree of discomfort, and after a while, we get to understand people and they get to understand us. But we can also have at worst, the most extreme side of things, really this sense of Cold War culture, where there is tension and there is ill feelings towards other people groups based on maybe what we have observed, from them. In other words, this culture Cold War describes an environment where we are constantly, where we constantly misunderstand one another's worldviews and behaviors, and where there is no platform or forum for us to find one another, for us to be able to find one another, to understand, okay, when you do that thing, this is what you are doing. This is what makes you do what you do. Without an open platform and a forum to find one another, there's going to be this Cold War. And we find these Cold Wars in the workplaces as an example, even in churches, by the way. For those of us who are in church, we find these Cold Wars, which obviously are unhelpful and unhealthy. In other words, in the absence of a platform of engagement, of an open platform of engagement, you're going to have some level of Cold War of cultures where there is this formation of unofficial homogeneous groups that maybe speak about the other group and even gossip about the other group, and that is very unhelpful in spaces. And we don't want that kind of culture. So that's a bit about definitions around culture. Culture is a way of life of a people group. Let's give some background to multiculturalism, and we're gonna zoom this into the context of South Africa and talk a little bit about the workplace construct in South Africa and all these things, because these are important things. Well, a bit of background. What has produced this multicultural environment that we are grappling with? Well, firstly, What's produced the multicultural environment is human migration. Since the early days of human civilization, humans have been migrating, moving from one place to another for various reasons, reasons of wars, reasons of economics, reasons of environment, as far back as since back in the days when God created humanity, there has been this constant movement. People move because back in the days they were looking for pastures for their flock, because they were running from wars. And in that movement is the mixing of the human race and people groups. So that's what we first see back in the days. Secondly, the multicultural context or space or topic arises because of European explorations. And if we come into the history of what has shaped the modern world, and as these European explorers moved and left Europe out of curiosity sometimes to find these new worlds, that has produced even a country like South Africa as a result. As a reason why we have different racial groups. So European explorations, industrial revolution, the advent of industrial revolution, the idea of going to work. And remember, before the Industrial Revolution, back in primitive days, where we found these agricultural economies or communities that were very much homogeneous. And the movement between the home and the field did not mean a switch of culture. The reality in terms of the world in which we live in 2024, in this era that we find ourselves, is that for some of us, the idea of moving from home to work carries with it the complexity of cultural switch and cultural shift. In other words, you have one cultural construct at home and another cultural construct at work. And it is so in the context of South Africa, with the kind of history that we have had in the politics of South Africa and the history of South Africa, we found that that is actually a reality. Someone living from a township, for instance, into the workplace, they are not just moving physically through the mode of transport, they are switching culturally every day. The complexity of that, I don't think we fully understand the complexity that that represents. And that's why spaces like these and these kind of spaces where we talk about these things allow us to begin to appreciate the complexity of work and of going to work. So industrial revolution, and of course, number 4, global trade or globalization, has led to really more and more the borders of national borders are becoming the thing of the past, especially with social media and virtual worlds and the idea of getting jobs. Now you can work for a company living in South Africa that is based somewhere else. And it takes the conversation of multiculturalism in a totally different context. And that's important to understand. So there is the issue of human migration, number 1, as contributors to multiculturalism. Human migration, European explorations, industrial revolution, and globalization. All of these things have contributed towards the multicultural or the phenomenon of multiculturalism. Colonialism and racism in a South African context, as an example, put that political twist to the conversation of multiculturalism. And I'll come back to this, but this is important, obviously, to understand. In other words, in a South African context, multiculturalism is not just this innocent process of interaction of cultures. There is a very strong political twist and dimension to this conversation that we need to be able to understand. Absolutely very, very important. Now, the workplace in its current form, like I kind of alluded earlier, is a construct of the era of industrial revolution. The workplace, the idea that tomorrow morning I'm going to wake up and go to work. That is an idea, construct of industrial revolution. It is where the workplace is where human beings or humans from diverse cultures congregate and interact around, on a daily basis, around a common mission of doing business. And why people do this? So the workplace is where human beings from diverse cultural backgrounds interact around a common mission of doing business. And why do humans do this? Is because this is driven by the idea of building careers, of pursuing purpose, finding a meaning of life, but also of securing livelihoods. And so the reality of it is that sometimes we work in spaces that we can regard as horrible culturally, but the realities of livelihood force us to wake up in the morning to go to work because we need that income at the end of the month. We need to be able to pay the bills. And so the workplace can be a front line, like I said earlier, but hopefully we want to make it to be a place of cultural exchange of some sort. Other places or spaces of multiculturalism are places of worship like church and schools. And we've seen in South African context, in fact, there's been very recent cases of multicultural interactions and even racism. And these things pop up from time to time. And we've got to be able to address them because the kids in our high schools are actually our future citizens. And if they don't learn these things early on in high school, they will be penalized when they do the very same things in the context of the workplace. Now, as we zoom into the South African context, we have to understand the dynamic and the complexity of migration of Blacks from what is rural township to urban spaces. There is a complexity. And that really is what defines multiculturalism processes in South Africa. It is that kind of migration that we have seen since the 90s into where we are. There's been a migration. The migration is one directional. That is important to appreciate. We are not really seeing the migration from urban spaces to townships, urban spaces to rural-based spaces. The migration, people are moving from townships and rural areas into urban spaces. And it is that migration is dominated by a particular people group or racial group. Now, that is very important for us to grapple with and to understand. And that influx of people, they are moving from the townships into from rural areas and townships into the urban spaces, into neighborhoods, into schools, into churches, and restaurants, all sorts of things. And there's an interesting dynamic. If you've been in South Africa for long enough, like me, you see that migration and the political twist that comes with it, and which you have to grapple with and address, is that the more the brown people move into what was previously white spaces, is the more you see another kind of migration happening, the exiting really of the white people group out of those spaces. And so interestingly, you can see a restaurant or a school that was historically white becoming more and more brown. And the more brown it becomes, is the more it triggers other kinds of migrations. And that's important for us to understand. There is another complexity to the evolution of multiculturalism, which we don't have to talk about this evening. The multiculturalism in its current context is the interaction of cultures based on ethnic groups. But actually, the evolution is one that is moving into ideological spaces. Very recently, Al Jazeera was having a talk show where they were grappling with an ideological divide amongst, Gen Z, as Americans would call them, Gen Z, if I'm a South African. There's this ideological divide that is happening amongst the gender groups of that kind of age group, and which means in the future, multiculturalism and diversity and interactions slowly is going to become more and more along ideological lines. I mean, you look at America and the elections, and you hear stories of people even deciding to toe the line around decisions of marriage between the Republican and Democrats. And we're seeing these, and these things are happening. And we see what's happening in the Middle East and how that is dividing the world, and COVID-19, how that divided the world. There is this emerging ideological divide, and that's a space that we have to start thinking about in the context of multiculturalism. So the South African story is one where we have had historically and even presently the issue of racism and a racialized economic inequality. And the Historical Group Areas Act also means that you obviously have the rural, the township, and then the urban space. The post-democracy South Africa has seen the migration of Blacks, as I said earlier, into what was previously white spaces. That has political complexities. The idea that only very recently, the other people groups within our nation are only being hosted within the context of certain spaces by another group. It carries with it some complexities. So suburbs, schools in suburbs, churches in suburbs, workplaces in suburbs. Now, the idea, the workplace in South Africa, by definition, is within the urban setting, actually. So the workplace means for the Black, for the Indians, and for the colored people group. I can use the word colored in the South African context for those who might be listening from outside South Africa. It's quite, I know, it's pretty acceptable. Means that if they're walking into a workplace, they are walking into some form of foreign space. They're actually being hosted by another culture. Now, churches within urban settings have to grapple with the same issues. Restaurants, anything urbanized is historically white in South Africa, and means that Blacks have to leave from a certain place to be able to enjoy those spaces. So migration, as I said, is one directional. It's not moving. There's no movement back to the township or certainly, by the economy is in the urbans. The construct of the economy is taking place by and large within the urban setting. Of course, we talk about the mixed economy in South Africa, the township economy, but the dominant economy, the economy that carries wealth, is in the context of the urban setting. And these are the things that this means that as these people groups, whether it's Blacks, Indians, coloreds, move into what was historically white spaces, they find a dominant hosting culture within those spaces. There's a hosting culture, and then they become these subcultures, and they get hosted by a particular culture. What do I mean by a hosting culture in a space? I'm defying that reality where the dominant norms that become a default standard, autopiloting life within a space, happen in a particular way and come from a particular people group. In other words, without the effort of transformation, we have an autopiloted space in which there is a culture dominance of a particular kind. That culture, therefore, defines the norms within that context. If you take the workplace, again, in the South African context, when you get into the workplace, there is the etiquette of the workplace, and that etiquette is defined historically by white culture. The very language that we speak is English. And that means we have to, language and culture are very much integrated, actually one. And there are things that cannot quite fully communicate if you're speaking not in your mother tongue. And that's the evidence of a host culture within the space. And whether that space is a church, in an urban setting, whether the church or the space is a restaurant, whether that place is the workplace, whether the place is a school, there will always be the host culture hosting other cultures, subcultures. And in other words, if left alone without the effort of transformation, it remains within that autopilot mode, and every other people group have to find a way, if they're going to be accepted, they have to find a way to assimilate, to adopt, to internalize that culture, or to live in protest. And we choose and either or in this context. And so if you take a white graduate, young adult walking into the workplace, there isn't much of culture shock that happens, because there is a seamlessness of language, there's seamlessness of etiquette in some sense. I'm going to share a little bit of my story in the workplace, actually. And then take the Black graduate coming from, like me, coming from a rural space, and universities never prepare you for that culture shock that you're going to actually encounter. And in fact, it can be argued that most of these Black graduates eventually get exited or kicked out by the systems, not on the basis of performance really, but on the basis of cultural complexities and the ability to be integrated within the context of a culture. What are the conversations that happen in the workplace? What jokes that get made in the workplace? Do you have the ability to understand those jokes? Because every joke has a cultural twist to it. Or generally, what makes me laugh is different from what may make another person laugh. Even my ability to understand, comprehend a joke. And so these are all the complexities that create anxiety and culture shock in a very, very real way. So in the context of my experience, coming out of KZN, rural KZN into eThekwini, into the workplace. My own journey. So, initially I worked for eThekwini municipality, which was Black dominated but white led. It wasn't too much of a culture shock. It was Black dominated, though it was still white led at the time, especially. And then from there, I moved into an FMCG, a fast moving consumer goods type company, a multinational. It was not only was it white dominated, it was also white led. That was quite an interesting experience if we're talking culture shock. What did I witness there? It was a great company. I think a lot of us loved it. It was a dynamic company in terms of career. Very white oriented in terms of culture. On Monday morning, it meant that you needed to hold a conversation on rugby. And this was long before the days of Siyakolisi and what we see in rugby now. So you had to hold a conversation. And your idea, the way the system saw your performance. Remember, performance appraisal is something that happens all the time. During the tea break, during the coffee break, at lunch, people observe you and to see whether they like you or not, to see whether you can be a manager within the space or not. And that is what caused anxiety, especially amongst the Black graduates. The environment was pretty intense to everybody, Black and white. It was a cutthroat type culture. It was a typical corporate culture, but there was that element of double impact for the Black graduates, because there was then the complexity of having to have a white boss who was oriented in a very different way. And so in a sense, within a space of 2 to 3 years, these graduates would resign. And you can argue they were not resigning from an organization, they were resigning from a culture, perhaps a culture of their boss. And that's because maybe the culture shock was prolonged, and that became a problem. And how about church in South Africa? Church is a devotional community. Church is a beautiful space ordained by God, but also church is a congregation of human beings who come from spaces and who represent certain cultures. Again, in the South African context, it also means that the racialization of the South African society has produced this idea of black church, white church, Indian church, colored church, which is actually not quite biblical. And so we have the church in the rural areas and township areas that is predominantly black, and the church in urban spaces that is historically white. Again, we've seen this one directional migration of blacks, young black middle class, moving from the township rural into the urban spaces, and perhaps loving the setting, loving the resourcefulness of the environment. And they have, and so in a sense, actually, the part of the complexity in South Africa is that the black church, especially, well, the church in rural areas and township, has experienced what you may call a form of a brain drain of some kind, as talent has left the townships and the rural areas. It means we also have to grapple with what drives us within that spiritual journey. Is it the voice of is it that inner voice of God, or is it economics and convenience? And a topic for another day. But that is important to grapple with in the context of church. Of particular interest for me in terms of church is how do historically white churches deal with the phenomenon of black migration and the influx of blacks in one sense. So how do these historically white churches deal with the phenomenon of black migration? Do they even recognize it? Is an important conversation. The second question we can ask there is that, is there a sense of spiritual meaning and purposeful belonging by blacks within these historically white churches? And I'm really talking about the subject of church as a construct of society in this context. We're not talking about church for the sake of church, but church as a social construct, really. So in some sense, our church is recognizing the black migration, but also in some sense, how are these young black professionals grappling with this issue of spiritual meaning and purposeful belonging within these historically white churches? There's a scripture in Acts chapter 6 that I would like to read for us in this context. And I think it illuminates this, this point I'm talking about. In Acts chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Grecian Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples, and we know the story. They gathered the disciples and they began to tackle the issue, which is the right leadership response to a problem. But the problem is this: there's two people groups, and the one people group feels like they're being overlooked. The word overlooked is, okay, it's actually firstly says they complained, which is the word to grumble and to murmur. And now that tells you that this is a group that did not feel like they had the power and the authority to officially raise an issue. What they opted to do was to murmur behind the scenes. Maybe they were having what we call parking lot conversations about the organization and about the things they don't like. So they were murmuring. The leadership did the right thing by recognizing and seeing the unhappiness, but they were murmuring. So they felt disempowered to engage the issue. And I think you kind of see in my observation this kind of reality within especially what is historically white churches in South Africa. So they were murmuring. In other words, to murmur really literally means to speak without a sound. In other words, it means that you feel like your voice cannot be heard, and yet you have a feeling and a thought to express. And so what you do, you have a parking lot conversation with those that look like you, because you feel like perhaps they will understand you. And that's what happens. Obviously, if that is prolonged, it leads to some problems. They were murmuring because they were feeling overlooked. And that word overlooked means to look at a thing by the side of another. To look at a thing by the side. In other words, to use the dominant culture to look at something else. And so in a sense, what we find in these churches, in the workplaces, is the eclipsing reality where the dominant culture eclipses the subcultures. So to understand Mabongi, I will understand her through the lens of the dominant group. And what she does in the process, what I determine to be good of her or bad of her is determined by the dominant group. And so what eventually happens is that the subgroups begin to, for the sake of survival, they begin to assimilate the dominant culture. And sometimes, it's fascinating for me to see blacks dance a certain way in these kind of churches, and it is a way in which we are seeking to survive within a space, and that's a complex issue that we are seeing within the church context. Now, let's land this with quickly. How do we then move towards multiculturalism? In conclusion, I want to throw to us a biblical character called Ruth. Ruth, we read in Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 to 18. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people." I'm paraphrasing it. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Now, when you look at the character called Ruth, we see a woman who's a Moabite, who gets married twice to Jewish men. That woman is very, very intent, is very set to produce, to engage within a particular cultural context. And I think it says here actually in Ruth that she was determined, and the word determined there means to be alert mentally and emotionally. If we're going to be the kind of people that pursue multiculturalism, we have to be like Ruth in the spaces, determined, mentally and emotionally alert. It also means to be determined, also means in this context to be bold and courageous, to prevail against challenges. And that's Ruth. She was a courageous woman who had a level of openness and curiosity and determination to engage beyond the comfort of her culture. Very, very interesting. So if we're going to build builders of multiculturalism within our own spaces, number one, we need to embrace the ideal of common humanity. Embrace the ideal of common humanity. Your people shall be my people. In other words, I'm not just embracing those who look like me and who speak my language only, but your people shall be my people. In other words, there's a degree of openness about me. I'm pursuing the project of humanity, of common humanity. We have to be willing, open and willing to engage. We have to be open and willing to engage. Like Ruth, we have to be open and willing. Long before experiences happen, we have to be open and willing to engage. But also we have to be curious. Let's restore a sense of curiosity. We have to be curious about other cultures and seek to understand them, seek to learn about them, read about them. There has to be a degree of curiosity if you're going to be a builder of multiculturalism. If you're not curious, this journey is not for you. You have to be curious, you have to be open and willing, and there has to be respect of other cultures. In other words, confront stereotypes inside of your own attitude and have respect for other cultures. Even as you desire for people to respect your culture, you've got to be able to return the favor. We have to be gracious and courageous. This journey requires grace. If people are going to offend you once and then you exit and resign, even in attitude, then this is not for you. You're going to be offended, not once, not twice, not 3 times, a couple of times, 7 times, 70 times. But also you're going to offend other people without even knowing, a couple of times. And so therefore there has to be grace and courage to engage. You have to be the kind of people who practice introspection. Go back, home and introspect about your own way of engaging with other cultures. And what did I do today? How did I converse with my work colleague today? What did I do? So introspection is important. And then let's join these kinds of spaces where there is shared learning and where we engage with other people who have the same interests as us to learn from other cultures so that we can be able to reflect on this and learn from this and share experiences. Without a common platform of sharing our experiences and learnings, there is never going to be the understanding of the other culture. So these kinds of spaces are so great, they are so needed, and I want to encourage us to be a part of them as we pursue this project of multiculturalism. Mabonge, thank you.
Thank you so much. I have so much, so many notes on my side. Thank you so much for that. And just that breakdown of practical things to do if we're going to be intentional about adapting into multicultural spaces. Thank you so much. I want to open this moment for questions on the floor. I'm almost certain that we're gonna go over at least by 5 minutes. So if you could just bear with us. I'm not seeing hands. Please raise your hand and unmute or drop your comment on the chat. For now, let me just read what I have here. Peggy says, good evening. It's true that different cultures create conflict within organizations. Will it be a solution if organizations have some sets of values and behaviors in place to subscribe to in order to prevent or manage individual culture clashes? That's such a good such a good question. And also, I think it has a very good suggestion to it, actually. I don't think that many organizations are intentional about putting multiculturalism as a value.
Yeah. So interestingly, I mean, I've recently did a talk in one of the schools, here in Durban on the same subject, on this idea of actually building organizational culture means that, number one, let's quantify the cultures that are in the space, understand them. But then the next step is not just quantifying the cultures that are in the space. It's also about the process of defining values for the organization. To define, because culture is formed out of values. Because the organization is a space in its own right. And if we're going to manage how people interact, there has to be some level of commonality of a value system that informs what is acceptable within that space, and what we regard as good within that space. And during that talk, I went as far as saying, organizations have to be serious about these things to a point of incorporating them into performance appraisal processes. In other words, anybody that is not respecting the culture cannot receive or get a promotion within that space. If we're promoting people that are disrespecting the culture of the organization, then we're sending a very, very confusing signal to the workplace community. And so in a sense, I was talking about this idea of forming not just a workforce, but a workplace community of people where people feel a sense of belonging because there has been a shaped value system along the way over time.
I like that. I am aware that many people here are leaders and others lead organizations, others are in executive positions, they are in positions of influence. You spoke about young people or graduates that give up because of the culture shock experience that has not been addressed. I almost want to say it should be our responsibility, us that have went before, to receive people of the same culture and help them adjust to the, to the culture that they're, I mean, it's easier for me to understand some of the challenges that a person from my culture would possibly go through in a workplace. It doesn't have to be HR that takes people through orientation for them to know the culture. What I tend to hear and see, though, we tend to orientate ourselves to negativity, not positivity, in terms of learning to adapt to other cultures. We tend to say, hey, look after yourself. We teach each other these tactics that propel bad behavior instead of us becoming a multicultural context. So do you have anything that people can adopt, practical things? You don't have to be a direct manager of somebody or a mentor or a coach, but something to help people adapt into spaces of work without this idea of them changing who they are.
Is that for me, Mamo, or are you asking?
Yes, for
Okay,
you.
okay, thank you, sir. Yeah, so I think it's very true that there tends to be a culture of murmuring, the car park conversation, as we saw in Acts chapter 6, as opposed to establishing forums of mentorship. And I think the practical steps for me would be exactly that those of us who have fought the battle, and have pioneered and are holding mainly to senior positions within the space must actually, set up these forums of mentorship, discipleship, whatever way that you want to use, to prepare the young graduates, not just for the job. In most cases, the problem that graduates face is not as less to do with the actual job. In most cases, the problem is relationships and culture. And where that is prolonged, again, the culture shock is prolonged, it becomes a problem. Eventually, people resign. If they don't resign in attitude, they resign practically. So I think the forums that are established, which must be official, by the way, and must be part of the policy of the organization, but stewarded by people that look like us, because to understand what a Black graduate will go through when they come into an organization, you kind of have to be a Black, you must have been a Black graduate yourself and must have gone through that experience. But you must have healed. If you're bitter, you cannot mentor anybody if you're bitter. So if you're bitter, excuse yourself. We don't want to impart bitterness. We don't want to impart the culture of murmuring. We want to impart leadership and mentorship and courage and identity within that context. So it is those who have gone through the system, have fought the battle, have been healed, to then approach the organization and say, I'm a middle manager, senior manager in this organization. I feel there must be official policy of mentorship as part of affirmative action in the process. In other words, affirmative action is not just the employment, it's not just the repopulation of the organization with color, but it is also the empowerment, the cultural empowerment that goes with it, so that as we pull in talent, we preserve talent within the space. And it's very important to have these mentorship forums in the process.
I like that very much. Last thing, I'm not seeing hands. Last thing, you mentioned something interesting about multiculturalism, and you spoke about how there is a hosting culture when it comes to urbanization, when people move to places of work. How can people set up entities that are open to receiving people from different cultures. I think what I know that policies would be helpful. I know that perhaps, having a leadership that is representing of different cultures has been a good strategy for many. But how in the everyday kind of activities, what can people do?
So I think important question. So beyond the policies, beyond populating our leadership structures with other race groups, we need to create a platform of conversation, of feedback, of reflection. We need to be courageous in a sense to deal with the elephant in the room. And that's better done again, not by a car park conversation, but by an official platform where we receive practical feedback about how people feel about the culture in the workplace. We cannot deconstruct a culture that we have not discerned. The culture needs to be discerned and quantified. And the only way that we do that is to receive feedback from those who are the casualties of that culture, not from the leaders of the organization, not from those who are privileged within the organization, but from those who are, exactly as we saw in Acts chapter 6, they gathered them and heard them. They created a platform for them to not murmur anymore, to not complain behind closed doors anymore, but they created a platform for people to be able to speak openly about their feeling. And people need to be confident that they can speak openly about their feeling without being penalized inside of their career pathways. And so the formation of these platforms of conversation, of reflection, of feedback, and that feedback is not the leadership telling people how people feel, it's leadership asking people how people feel and receiving, gathering that feedback, because the people who are the casualties, like I said, of the culture are the ones who are best placed to be able to voice out how the culture is making them feel. The conversation oftentimes is not so much about our good intentions as it is about how the other person feels about what we do. So the process is not to defend ourselves. No, when I do this is what I mean, or this is what I intend. This is my good intention. No, the issue is not good intention. The issue is how the other person is made to feel. And if we're gonna start to appreciate how a culture makes other people feel, that's where I think the deconstruction process begins. If we're going to dismantle the hosting culture, we're going to have to quantify it. We can't dismantle something that we don't quantify and appreciate. And the only way is to get feedback from people, is to create official platforms where people feel safe and are trusting enough to be able to truly say what they feel and how they feel about a particular culture. And I think that's the beginning point of that journey. As we get that feedback, then the process does not end with gathering feedback. It has to then move into defining what is our ideal environment. So we deconstruct to construct. We therefore have to define together with the people what sort of family we want to become, what sort of community we want to become. And then we need to start to practice that together. And I think formalize like I said earlier, to the point where anybody that disrespects the values that have been agreed upon cannot be receiving promotions all at the same time. Because if we do that, then we are confusing the people.
I love that, and I find that people get scared to talk and say their views when these surveys are being done in workplaces. I think we perhaps at the responsibility level, we have to be courageous to speak out. Can I give you a chance to ask your question, because I'm not seeing it on the chat and I'm not sure if you've dropped it. Please unmute. I'm not seeing you. Okay, I'm not sure. Let me just try and see. But thank you so much for that. I will now stop the recording. I'm not seeing Du's question. I really thank you for how you've broken it down, from just giving us the background of what multiculturalism mean and how the interfacing of these cultures affect us on a daily basis. Sometimes we don't understand the impact that it has on people's well-being unless we have experienced it. And so I really appreciate you for taking us through that. Just last comment that I'm seeing here. Oh my goodness.
Mabongi, I think ukuthi umuntu uyisende direct kumina ilokhuzana ndama i-message uyena lo. So manje sengiyikhophile ngabe sengiyayisende.
Awesome. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Please bear with us. Shall we take this question because it's already here? Greetings, my great sir, in the speak of exhortation. I'm looking for the question. I don't think I'll be able to read everything. How do we plug back the cultural norms? And also, as a pastor, why do we think the body of Christ is so silent on these issues? And the is the silence because they may be praying about it in closed doors, or are we ignoring it because we think it's far from us? And then he says, I follow prayer groups in KZN, for an example, Umtandazo wasentabeni, where it's normally hosted the generals of faith like Prophet Msingano, Bishop, many bishops there. And then, but I have never heard them in that mountain praying, taking stand. I know they have prayed for elections or asking this to a pastor now. Are we ignoring this, Mfundis? Sorry, I was trying to get through the, so that we get to the question quicker.
Yes. So it is a multi-layered question that. So one, I think there is a concept of church where our idea of church is the Sunday morning, and anything beyond that we don't see as relevant to what we do. So that is perhaps an issue of doctrine and our understanding of what church is. One, two, perhaps there is an issue of uneasiness and fear to tackle this, because maybe for fear that it can offend people. I mean, we look at the early church and significant leaders like Peter, the apostle in Antioch, interacting with the Gentiles, and when the believers from Jerusalem arrive, he withdraws. So leaders can be fearful, and I think there is that. But perhaps to encourage my brother, there is work going on. There is work that we're doing in the city, actually around this issue, and so yes, a part of church is silent on the issue for various reasons, partly because of our concept of church, where our business is Sunday morning, and anything beyond that is none of our business, and that's not quite biblical. Partly because of fear, as we see Peter in Antioch and Paul addressing that issue in his letter to the Galatians, and how Peter sought to please the believers from Jerusalem. He didn't want to be in trouble with them. So there was an issue of fear. Leaders can be fearful. But in all of that, there is work that is going on. There's work that we've been doing in the city. So, my brother is very much welcome to reach out if he wishes to be part of that. We have created multiple platforms to address this very same issue within the city, because we believe that it is very, very important for the church, because church is also a social construct. It's a devotional community, but it's also a social construct. It is for that reason that the Bible gives us civil instructions about life, about families, about marriages, about relationships, because the Bible recognizes the church as a social construct of some sort. And so leaders must be able to tackle this. So there is work that is going on, and I do encourage my brother to reach out.
Thank you so much. I will share a link to LSA website where most of your articles are on different subjects, including this one, I think. And then what we're going to do as well, I'm going to share contacts as well, where if you are in a company or an organization and you need consult on this subject, we are happy to actually service you. Robert Ntuli is open to servicing you. Please go ahead and use those contacts. Thank you so much tonight, community. Thank you for bearing with us on the time. I'll now